My patron Big Foamy has said, I have a question regarding the performance of divisions such as the SS or NKVD divisions. I have heard recently that whilst the German SS, as opposed to the foreign conscript volunteer SS, were certainly more fanatical in attack or defence than their Heer counterparts, they also suffered significantly higher casualties, and that especially in the early days they were maligned by poor performance. Was this really the case? In a similar vein, I'm also curious about how the NKVD divisions performed in comparison to the rifle divisions. I've read different things about how they were essentially a police force, but I believe in your Foulblau video you said one or more NKVD divisions fought to the last. In summary then, how did these party political divisions compare to their main army counterparts, and perhaps even with each other? Thanks. Great question, and this ties into a video I did recently on the SS, where I explained that more than half of the SS divisions weren't in fact German. They were foreign, non-German SS units, which is interesting. Now, you're right that these guys are fanatical troops, they are party political divisions, and they are obsessed with their own ideology. However, that does not necessarily mean that they are elite troops, and there is evidence that a lot of these were poor performers on the battlefield. And I'm just going to start off by showing you another fanatical party political unit which certainly did really badly, and that was the Italian black shirt battalions. These guys were basically no more than a militia force. Now, they were fanatical fascists, but if you watch my Operation Compass documentary, which was a while ago I did that, you'll see that a lot of black shirt battalions just basically got wiped out. There was one battalion in Operation Crusader, which is a long video, but that one was dug in on a hill, was attacked by a handful of British tanks, and it was supported by artillery and other Italian tanks, so it did okay, but even then it wasn't great. And there was one I recently mentioned in my Stalingrad series which just got thrown in and was annihilated. So these guys were fanatical fascists, but that didn't translate to great battlefield performance. So taking the Italian black shirt battalions as a bit of a guide, we can see, okay, yes, they had fanaticalness, they also had party politicalness, but they didn't have great equipment, they didn't have great training, and essentially they were just a militia force. So when we look at the SS and NKVD divisions, what we're looking for is not just fanaticalness and party politicalness, but we're also looking for things like training, experience, and equipment, and we're looking for organisation, etc. So we need a bit more than just fanaticalness and party politicalness. And a great place to start, I think, is the 10th NKVD division at Stalingrad. This particular division was drawn from Stalingrad itself, so consisted of local civilians in uniform, and the NKVD were the secret police, so this is basically a police division. This particular division goes into combat on the 23rd of August 1942, which just happens to be the next episode of Stalingrad, which should be coming out next week, fingers crossed if I get it finished in time. So I'll be covering the fighting that this division does in detail, in depth, in that series, so I'm not going to go into detail here, but what I will say is that it goes into action on the 23rd of August and basically gets whittled down over a course of, weeks and months until it is basically no more. And a shout out to Anton Jolly, Stalingrad Battle Data, for providing me with the 10th NKVD Division's strength return for the 13th of September 1942. His channel will be linked in the description below. So in this graph, the top line shows the 10th NKVD Division's strength on the 13th of September 1942, compared to the second line, which is a authorised strength of the regular rifle divisions. Couple of things to note here with these numbers, because it's not really a fair comparison, and I'm going to explain why. The first thing to note is that the authorised strength of a regular rifle division might have been 10,386 men. However, unless all the planets aligned and pigs were flying, the chances are you're not going to get a division with 10,386 men. A lot of the regular rifle divisions that were arriving fresh off the barracks at Stalingrad were coming in at 7,000 men, 8,000 men. So if a regular rifle division came off the barracks and headed towards Stalingrad with 10,000 men, it was basically a dream come true. Plus, the 10th NKVD division had been in combat for over 20 days at this point, so it wasn't at its full strength either. Now, yes, it had only been in relatively minor combat up until this point. It only really got into heavy combat after the 13th of September, but it's still not at 100% strength, so this really isn't a fair comparison. But we have to work with what we've got, and even though they're not ideal, these numbers do allow us to come to some interesting conclusions. So, looking at the first couple of columns, we might be able to say, okay, the reason why they had a few less men and a few less rifles might be because they've been in combat for a little while and they probably lost them. But how do you explain the heavy machine guns, or the light machine guns? That's quite a lot of difference there. In fact, that's more than half. But they had a lot more submachine guns, 1,080, which is more than the authorised strength of a regular rifle division, even though the 10th NKVD had already been in combat for a while, so they actually had a lot more submachine guns than a rifle division ever would. Now you might argue that the reason they had more submachine guns is because they're in the city of Stalingrad, and having submachine guns rather than rifles makes sense. And I would agree, except we don't see a reduction in rifles, we actually see a reduction in heavy machine guns and light machine guns, meaning they're not really trading single-shot rifles for rapid-firing weaponry, they're just kind of choosing submachine guns for some reason more than the heavy machine guns and the light machine guns. So saying that they chose rapid-firing weaponry rather than single-shot rifles doesn't make any sense because the evidence here is contradictory. The reality is that they were armed with submachine guns because police prefer them. If you're in a city and you've got a submachine gun, you're doing well, you don't need a heavy machine gun to be a policeman, you just need a submachine gun. So that makes sense. And this explains why they don't have a lot of anti-tank rifles, because a regular policeman doesn't need an anti-tank rifle. And so they were issued this later on as an afterthought. Same with the mortars, a regular policeman doesn't need a mortar. Anti-tank guns, like 45mm guns, you don't need them as a policeman usually, so they were issued later on. Same with the heavy and light machine guns. And of course, a police unit maybe needs some horses, maybe needs some cars and trucks, but it's a unit that's going to stand still. It's going to be in a city, it's not going to wander off over the steppe, so it doesn't need much mobility, and therefore doesn't need a lot of trucks or cars. So this is suggesting that, yes, they were a police force with rifles and submachine guns for the most part, and then they were issued with heavier equipment as the front came near, but they didn't have enough to go around, so they ended up with a lot of mortars and some anti-tank rifles and heavy machine guns, but there's not enough to make this into a regular division. And one more thing to note, a regular rifle division would be split into 3 rifle regiments. The 10th NKVD division was split into 5 rifle regiments. So this had organisational implications and also battlefield implications, because a regular rifle division with 10,386 men, if all the planets aligned, would have rifle regiments of roughly 3,000 men each. And the 10th NKVD division didn't have that. Most of its regiments were at 1,500 men, roughly speaking. So NKVD division regiments were pretty weak compared to their rifle regiment comparisons, and they were probably about the strength of 2 battalions, which is a really odd number. I'm not sure what to make of this, if I'm honest, but it just screams, hey, this is not a regular, army division, this is a police unit which has just been mobilised for war. But how did it perform, right? Because, these guys are police, they are fanatical, they're party political. Okay, yeah, they didn't have as much heavy equipment, but surely, their fanaticism would have made up for this lack of mortars and heavy machine guns, right? Well, they were used to keep order at first, and then they were used to plug gaps in the line. And they did okay at the start. But they only really did well because they were in the north of Stalingrad in what was known as the Olovka salient, and the Olovka salient was more or less left alone at the start of the battle, and Paulus's main concentration point on the city of Stalingrad was in the south and then the centre of the city, so for the most part they were left alone at the beginning. and they slowly lost troops, and then when Paulus started to concentrate more on the Olovka salient, they didn't do so well. In fact, if you look at that scene from Enemy at the Gates where the NKVD, they're there with machine guns and whistles and going, right, attack, and everybody attacks, and then they fail, and then they start whittling their way back, and the NKVD are like, no, don't come back, we'll shoot you, and then they end up shooting them. This is pretty much the opposite of what actually happened. In fact, at one part of the battle, the regular rifle division units and the 10th NKVD are fighting side by side, and the Germans attack, and some of these units flee. And there's a report from the Soviets themselves saying most of the guys who fled were NKVD guys. Not the regular rifle. The regular rifle division units stayed where they were and died on the battlefield, and it was the NKVD guys who fled. So yes, it's almost the complete opposite of that scene from Enemy at the Gates, and I can't wait to get to it in the series so I can go into a bit more detail for you. There was also an 8th NKVD division, which fought with Danilov's 21st Army in the opening stages of Fall Blau, and 40th Panzer Corps met stubborn resistance south of Rostov at a river guarded in part by the 11th NKVD division, who apparently fought with, quote, wild stubbornness. And at a place called Mineralny Vody, 11th NKVD division plus other units held up the 3rd and 23rd Panzer divisions for 2 days in early August. But it wasn't NKVD divisions that got destroyed in Fall Blau, it was NKVD security units or minor units like battalions and regiments at places like Voronezh and Rostov. But I would say that overall a NKVD division was weaker than a regular rifle division. So now we're going to look at the SS divisions, and we're going to look at 2 in this instance. And the first one we're going to look at is the 6th SS Nord Division. This ties into my recent videos on Finland and then Sweden as well, because SS Division Nord took part in the first offensives in Finland against the Soviet Union, aiming towards the Murmansk railway lines. This was Operation Arctic Fox, and the units taking part in it were the 169th Infantry Division, which was German, the SS Kampfgruppe Nord, which actually was a division at this time, even though it wasn't called a division, and the Finnish 6th Division. And these were all under 36th Army Corps' command. Nearby there was also 3rd Army Corps with another division and some other battalions. So technically I have to point out that the SS Nord Division consisted of Volksdeutsche, which is German people. Now the problem with this is that the Nazis themselves said no, Volksdeutsche were not full Germans, they were, let's say, 90% German. Well, in my eyes, this counts them as full German, but depending on how you see it, you may not count this as the way. So going back to the original question, this may be counted as a foreign unit, but I actually see it as a full German unit. So it really depends on how you see it. Either way, there were some Germans in this unit, and they, well, in fact, I'll tell you what, let's just let Lunde explain what happened. The questions about the combat effectiveness of SS Division Nord were answered on the first day of battle, the 1st of July 1941. Against determined Soviet defenders, the division broke and ran. Panicky SS troops streamed past the Corps headquarters. There was total confusion at the front. The division operations officer could only account for 2 of the 6 battalions. Major General Demmelhuber declared that his division was not fit for combat operations on the morning of July 2nd. Losses in the SS division on July 1st included 1 regimental commander, 1 battalion commander, and 600 men. The SS division was moved into defensive positions behind the Finnish border after its panic on July 1st. Now, while the 169th Infantry Division was assembling its forces for a crossing of the Kula River and the assault on Sala, there was another panic in the SS division. This episode evidently started when General Demmelhuber, believing that his division was under an armoured attack and having no confidence in his troops, ordered a withdrawal that turned into a panic. On this occasion, some of the guys fled 50 miles to a bridge, where they told the guy in charge of the bridge to blow the bridge because they were being chased by the Russians, which they weren't. So they actually withdrew the division on the 6th of July, and yeah, so the division had actually fled twice. And it was because of this that the German and Finnish units in that area were no longer strong enough to go all the way to cut the Murmansk railway. And it may have been this incident, plus others, which convinced Mannerheim that the German troops that were in Finland were pretty poor, and thus the Germans as a whole were not particularly great fighters. Which might be why he decided not to advance further than necessary during the continuation war. So going back to Foamy's original question, this SS division was fanatical, it was party political, but it did suffer significantly higher casualties and was maligned by poor performance. Now I did say this was Volksdeutsche, so you might possibly argue that this wasn't German SS. I would disagree, I think it was, but you might argue it wasn't. However, there is another German division which we can take a look at, which was definitely German. And that division is the 10th SS Panzer Division, Frundsberg. The best part about this division is that it is full German, it is also SS, it is fanatical, it's party political, but it also suffers higher casualties and has poor performance. But it has poor performance not in the early days, but in the later days of the war, specifically in Operation Market Garden at Nijmegen, 1944. Now, I have covered Operation Market Garden a million times. In fact, the first documentary I made on this channel was my original Operation Market Garden documentary. So go ahead and watch that. Go and watch the other videos if you want a lot of context. But just to briefly sum it up, the 10th SS Panzer Division was in Nijmegen City. It had been digging in for about 2 to 3 days at this point. The British had got to Nijmegen and they were now attacking the 10th SS Panzer Division, but it was holding kind of strong, although it was getting squeezed. The 82nd Airborne cross over the river and start to move towards the Nijmegen bridges. Having witnessed the successful river assault, many of the German defenders in the west of Nijmegen tried to make their escape over the railway bridge. Small groups of American paratroopers, however, from H&I companies of Cook's 3rd Battalion were already at the northern end. Quickly setting up BAR machine guns, they began to rake the fleeing columns with fire. Although outnumbering this small outpost, the Germans were intent on flight alone. Later, 267 German bodies were recovered from the railway bridge after the retreat. Now, to be fair, there was a threat of them being surrounded. They were under pressure already from the British and the 82nd Airborne on the land, so yeah, you can kind of understand why they did flee. However, only part of the division fled, the other part stayed in its trenches and carried on fighting, so there was 2 elements here. The point of the matter is, though, this is an SS Panzer Division. It is also full German, not just Volksdeutsche. This is later in the war, this is 1944, and despite being fanatical, despite being party loyal, blah 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 blah, they fled. There's no way around this, they actually fled. And yes, you could say, well, they were depleted and so on, and I get that, but the point is, these fanatical troops are meant to be elite, and they're meant to stand their ground and hold to the last man, and yet here we go, they're actually fleeing across the bridge. And this was flight, it wasn't, oh, we're going to withdraw, this was an actual flight, that's why there's so many guys dead on the bridge. Now, I'm highlighting these 2 particular incidents with the 6th SS Division Nord and the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg for a couple of different reasons. The first is that it shows the poor performance of the SS on attack and defence. You get both Volksdeutsche and German SS. You're seeing poor performance in the early war and the late war. And it's a nice comparison to the 10th NKVD division that fought at Stalingrad, which also fled. Now you might say, yeah, but these weren't the better divisions of the SS, these were like the, lower down the ranks. Well, there are instances where, let's say the 3rd Totenkopf Division also fled at the Battle of Arras when the British counterattacked in 1940. So there are other instances where the so-called elite SS divisions fled or didn't perform particularly well. And if we go back to the point I brought up right at the beginning about the Italian black shirt battalions, just because you're fanatical, party, politically elite does not necessarily translate to great soldiers. Now, it wouldn't be right to paint a broad brushstroke and go NKVD and SS divisions are all cowards. Like, we can't do that, because if we look at 10th SS Division at Nijmegen, some of them fled, but some of them stand their ground. So we can't paint a broad brushstroke and say they're all rubbish. But we can't also go, well, they're all amazing elite guys, because that's not true either. And in the case of the SS, we can't even go, well, the German units did really well, and the non-German units didn't do very well, because we've got evidence of the German units themselves, and the Volksdeutsche, not doing so well. So when Big Foamy says, oh, you know, is this really the case? Are these units poor? I don't know if we can actually come to that conclusion. We can say individual units were poor, but we have to look at each individual unit on a case-by-case basis, and then sort of figure out if that unit was a good unit or bad unit, or was it just circumstances or whatever. Now, Bigman Foamy does say that we hear that these units are more fanatical in attack or defence. Well, I would use the word reckless. Now, a lot of the German attacks in World War II are reckless. In fact, that is kind of what Blitzkrieg was all about, or Bewegungskrieg. That's what it was all about. Break through the enemy lines, right off into the sunset and try and encircle and whatever, and don't worry about the flanks, don't worry about your supply lines, just get to your objective and hope for the best. You know, we hear it at Dunkirk, no, we're going to stop the tanks, prevent, you know, because we've got to sort out supply lines, you're going too fast. We see it with Rommel, who's, you know, trying to encircle the British numerous times by driving across the desert in North Africa. In the Stalingrad campaign, we've seen it before with the Battle of Kalach, where Wittersheim's corps breaks through on the 23rd of July and tries to get to Kalach, but then is counterattacked numerous times on the flanks, and it slows him down for like 2 weeks almost. We're about to see it again in the series, where he tries to get to the Volga, and indeed does get to the Volga, and then gets surrounded. Spoiler alert, if you don't know the Battle of Stalingrad. So, you know, reckless assaults is probably the best way to put it, because Wittersheim's just going to his objective and forgetting about his flanks and his rear. Well, that's a reckless assault. So I'm not sure there's much of a difference between a German SS attack and a German army attack. I think they're pretty much the same. Same with the defense as well. You've seen it a load of times where, you know, there's stand fast orders and fortress town orders, and that's done by the SS and the army. So really, is there any difference there? And if we look at the books, I'm not the only one to come to this kind of conclusion. Wheeler, in his book The SS, A New History, which I think is pretty good, he says this: the Waffen-SS was certainly not a military elite. The leadership, training, equipment, and tactical effectiveness of these formations varied from excellent to abysmal. Some of its longer established formations, primarily composed of native German volunteers and led by men who had been through officer training school, were of a very high standard indeed. And he goes on to say that the non-German formations were definitely really bad. But then he says, most German members of the Waffen-SS and some volunteers from the occupied territories saw themselves as part of a corps d'elite, as was expected within the SS's ideological framework. But this was as much racial political as it was military. So yeah, maybe most of them did believe that they were amazing, great troops, but that doesn't mean they actually were. I really do think you have to look at things from a case-by-case basis, and this is why the devil's in the details. We need to go down to the divisional level, or if not lower, to see exactly what's happening. And to wind this video up, I'm going to encourage you to watch a lecture by Robert Citino, which is on YouTube, where he talks about the situation in 1943. And as part of this video, he talks about the Hermann Goering Parachute Panzer Division, which also attacked recklessly at Sicily. And that division, the Parachute Panzer Division, is not a army or a SS division, and yet it also attacked recklessly. So I think it's just German doctrine in World War II. Go and check that lecture out. It's a brilliant lecture. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.